Today I'm going to paint a waterfall, and specifically the Bariri Falls in the North Island of New Zealand, which I was fortunate enough to go and visit on a recent trip. And I spent most of the time actually hiking to get to the waterfall, not just to the bottom view here, but also all the way to the top. And I didn't really get time to sketch, but I took plenty of footage and photos to paint in the studio. So you can see the reference photo here, and the first thing I did was a few thumbnail sketches, and you can already tell how I struggled with this composition because it's really actually not that attractive. I tried to figure out where the light was, and I kind of got stuck on this sort of window cross that I have here. Tried offsetting, the top and the bottom half, but I kind of didn't really resolve it all that well, so I sort of ended up drawing the same thing over and over again. Here I sort of tried to, what if I just made it one big long waterfall and a much bigger dark shape, and that was probably the one thumbnail where I went, oh, I'll try this, and sort of ended up with this watercolor here. Yeah, and I didn't like it. The only thing I really like is how this tree came out. That was quite nice. That shape was a bit too steep. I also didn't get the waterfall quite vertical, so it's a bit wonky. So I got quite frustrated with this painting, and I put that aside. And then I did two tiny little studies, just 5-minute studies, and I kind of had a bit of a breakthrough and thinking of, oh, this can be really wet and just dropping in that green rather than cutting it out as a light shape and making it a little bit more natural. And then I also found that getting a kink in there, here, this kink here, would make it a lot more interesting. And that's how we ended up with this final piece. So that is a quarter sheet. You can see I have much more room than here, and I've got more depth in my wet and wet wash here, and a much more softer approach to this top half, and then a more hard edges and detail around here, which is kind of the focal point of the painting. So again, multiple steps to get to a painting that I am satisfied with. If you want to watch the actual painting process, then of course stick around. I'll have lots more to talk about how I painted this in the next few minutes. As I mentioned in the intro, this is going to be a pretty big wet and wet job, so no surprises that I'm starting with clear water to wet most of the area that I'm going to be painting. And I start with the cliffs, and I'm leaving the sky and the waterfall itself untouched, so dry, so that I can preserve the white and put in the sky later. And then I start with my really bright greens. Now I'm using a primary yellow, and that's actually the name of the color, by Mamiri Blue. It's not a lemon yellow, it's a little bit more neutral than that. It's not really cool or warm, it's just a really bright yellow. And I find it really hard to never pollute my yellow with a little bit of residue on my palette, so it never really is clean yellow. It almost has a green tint no matter what I try and do. So that's why I don't bother really mixing that light green with anything. It's just yellow. And then I'm using different types of blues that I'm dropping in pretty much straight into the remaining white spaces there, and also making sure it touches a little bit of that yellow to mix green on the page. Now, I can't give you a really scientific breakdown of exactly what I'm doing. I'm flying by the seat of my pants here. I'm using ultramarine blue, a cerulean blue, and something that resembles a Windsor blue or a phthalo blue, which has a bit of a green bias in it by default. So out of those three blues and the yellow, I'm mixing those sort of green and blue tones. And then I'm also dropping in a bit of burnt sienna just to push it a little bit more into a neutral. And then I will also put in a little bit of a rose color. Actually, mine is magenta, but quinacridone rose or any of those really vibrant reds will help mute any kind of greens. Because I want to get the effect of a warm colors and bright colors for those sunlit areas, and then the cliffs, the rock faces, really cool. So I've got this warm, cool contrast happening between the greens and the rock and the blue. I'm spending quite a bit of time. I'm cutting out obviously a lot of the fluff in this video. So this is obviously a much shorter version than the real painting. I would have probably spent a good 20 minutes to a half an hour just on this first wet and wet stage, continuously dropping in different colors and values, trying to build it up. Because I had the intent of really trying to finish this in the first wash, as in not the whole painting, but this cliff face. I will end up letting it dry and then going over it, because still after all those years, I misjudge how light watercolor dries, even when you pile on the layers in this first wet and wet wash. But because we start with clear water and then come in with relatively diluted washes, there's so much water already in the paper that no matter what you do in subsequent wet and wet washes, it will just evaporate and dry 30 to almost 50% lighter than what you can see at the moment. And yes, I do get caught out still when I paint wet and wet, but that's okay. Still, hopefully got a few years to live and to learn on how to mix stronger pigments in my first wet and wet washes. On the other hand, I don't mind. I like letting it dry and come back and strengthening things, because you can see there I'm just continuously building up those different layers. And then I'm just dropping in a few water splatters for some texture into that tree area. Now, there isn't a very strong and obvious light source for this painting. It was late morning, close to midday, so the sun's pretty high up in the sky, top down light. So I'm going to add a bit of shadow sort of underneath things like this vegetation there on the right hand cliff, and I'm smudging it. I want fairly soft transitions. Time to drop in some of the rocks, and because my darker cliffs, you can see they are leaning into purple, I'm going to keep the rocks more on the yellow side, so raw sienna predominantly. They're not exactly complementary colors, but close enough, having a warm yellowy color next to a cool purple just enhances the contrast between them. I'm gonna add some of the shadows underneath the rocks. Again, light comes from the top, so just the underside of the rocks with a darker color. Now that main tree there in the front, that needs more definition. This is closer to us, and then the cliffs, so I need to create details and some hard edges around the outside of the tree, and I'm doing that with negative painting. As I said earlier, I want the bottom half of the waterfall to be darker than the top, so that it recedes a bit further and we keep pulling into the focal area where the water goes behind the rocks there. So I'm happy to build up more and more depth and value into that bottom cliff and trying to cut out that tree. I do admit I struggled a little bit getting the shape of the tree right, and I will have to come back to this area later one more time to finish it off. I'm going to scratch out a few tree branches to get a bit more detail into that area, make it less like a big shrub, but starting to create the illusion of that is actually a tree that's growing and leaning into our picture. I'm using a very soft synthetic brush by Princeton. It's a Neptune, pretty good for foliage and organic matters. Bit of cerulean for the sky. The sky plays a very minimal role in this painting, but I didn't want to leave the sky white, even though it was a very bright day and the sun's up there. I wanted to have a difference between the sky and the waterfall, and you can see it just pops out the water even more. And speaking of that waterfall, it can't be pure white because obviously that is also a little bit in shade and it's not pure white. If you look at the reference photo or the video at the beginning, you can see that there is actually hardly any white on the waterfall. It's very dark. It's almost the color of the cliffs, but you know, this is the artistic license that we can take. I do want it to make it brighter than what the original is, but as you can see, I've added some shadow into it. This is a really light blue cerulean with a hint of lavender mixed into it, and I'm just creating a bit of texture into that water so that it feels like it's moving and it is splitting over the rocks, and we can see a bit of the cliff face behind it. I used a flat brush at first, and now I'm just adding a few details with a round brush. Those rocks look a little bit flat still, just adding a bit more shadows just to create a bit more realism there. And then I'm coming back to my tree branch. I want to have those stand out a bit more, so some titanium white over the top, just so that they stand out a little bit more. I'm going to add a few white splatters. I want a bit more movement and suggest detail in that bottom area. Keep building the focal area. And then I took off the tape and I thought I was finished, but then I let it dry and came back a couple of hours later and thought, there is too much of the same value across the painting. The top half and the bottom half of the cliffs are too much of the same, and there is still not enough drama and strength in my focal area there where the rocks are and the waterfall goes behind it. So one more layer of my darkest value, and I'm carving around the rocks and also the trees using my flat brush again, because when you work with rock shapes, flat brushes really help to get some of the angles. And now I switch to a round brush, cutting into that tree with small little movements. When you paint trees, keep the main area quite solid, but take care of the edges. And I actually thought my tree was a bit too solid. It was covering too much of the area in front of the cliffs and it felt a little bit unnatural, so I'm gonna punch out a few holes. And I do that by painting the same color as the background, the cliff face. And I paint around the branches, which helps them to stand out a bit more. And now my tree has a few more gaps and feels a bit less solid and more delicate, really. That's the word I was looking for. With a slightly lighter value, I'm just adding a few more shadows underneath the crowns to add some extra dimension and realism. And that's the result I ended up with. I always love to hear what you think of my videos and my paintings, so please leave me a comment. Thank you.